I'm very happy to be introducing our two keynote panelists today. We have Patricia Landolt, who is chair of the Department of Sociology at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. Her research examines the production and reproduction of systems of social exclusion and inequality associated with global migrations. Specific themes include refugee migrant political incorporation, precarious work and income insecurity, non-citizenship and precarious legal status. She teaches courses in international migration, immigrant incorporation and transnationalism, as well as ethnicity and racialization, social inequality, and qualitative methods. She is the author, most recently, of Producing and Negotiating Non-Citizenship, Precarious Legal Status in Canada with Lewin Goldring. Next to her, we have Doug Young, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Social Science here at York University. His current research is primarily in two areas: the legacies of socialist and modernist urbanism in Berlin, Hanoi, and Stockholm, and the processes of suburban decline and renewal in Toronto and Leipzig. He is the co-author with Julien Boudreau and Roger Kyle of Changing Toronto, Governing Urban Neoliberalism, and co-editor with Patricia Wood and Roger Kyle of In Between Infrastructure, Urban Connectivity in the Age of Vulnerability. So welcome to the two of them, and please join us in welcoming.
So I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm happy about that. I usually force myself to put things on PowerPoint, but really there's no need for it, and then you can see my face a little bit. Okay, so thank you, Carlo, who tracked me down, I'm not sure how, and invited me to participate. I really enjoyed the panel that I did get to see, and so I'm working on a paper that's related to my presentation, and already the conversations from that have actually helped me a lot. The title of my talk has changed a little bit, and I think reflects more clearly what I think I'm trying to figure out. So it's called Habituating to Precarity in a Toronto Priority Neighborhood. Oops, I should turn this thing on. There. Unfree labor, unpaid work, and unsettled working class politics. So my starting point is that I'm interested in making sense of the diversity and inconsistency of narratives and interpretations about work and jobs that circulate among workers and residents of a marginalized urban neighborhood in Toronto. So I'm interested in explaining these narratives and their seemingly inconsistent interpretations of work, and understanding what they can tell us about the organization of work and contemporary post-work working class politics. Data for the presentation, and you won't hear a lot about the data, but there is some data. Data for the presentation comes from a project I conducted with Access Alliance. The project was carried out between 2009 and 2011 in Black Creek. And in that project, we examined the obstacles precariously employed, racialized workers face in the labor market, the strategies they develop to find work and achieve income security, and the impact of these on their health. And so we conducted two types of focus groups. We ran 8 focus groups with workers who were precariously employed and racialized, and across 5 ethno-linguistic groups. And we conducted 3 focus groups with community, agency, frontline workers, and management staff who were involved predominantly in the design and delivery of employment-related programs and services in agencies that are located in Black Creek. So Black Creek, Northwest Toronto, Jane Finch. The focus group interviews with workers revealed, again, considerable variation in evaluations of precarious employment. Some of them characterized temp agencies, which all of them had signed up to work through, as legalized slavery. Others, in a similar employment relationship, saw temping as a possible stepping stone to fulfill full-time permanent work. It's not that they loved the job, but they saw it with a certain degree of hopefulness. When asked about their strategies for finding better jobs, right, so not on the job, but looking for work, everyone talked about similar strategies: volunteer work, job readiness clinics, resume workshops, internships, and all of the focus group participants, so 90 people, had tried all of these things. And again, respondents varied in their analysis. Some saw unpaid volunteer work, for example, as socially condoned exploitation, and others as a chance to network and skill build as a step towards being job ready. Community agency workers, frontline and management, express similar uncertainty about the relationship between the programs through which they make their clients job ready and success in finding and keeping decent work. The unsettled and contradictory characterization captured among Black Creek residents is echoed in the literature. Scholars readily acknowledge that global and local transformations in the organization of work are having profound implications for workers, worker politics, and society. In broad terms, we know that globalized production systems and state regulations have redefined the legal and normative basis of the employment relationship. There is a blurring, both spatial and temporal, of the boundaries between wage work and other spheres. So the boundary between the shop floor and the home, between work and school, between leisure time and work time, family time and work time. All of these boundaries are being eroded and rewritten. So the grand narratives that seeks to explain this transformation have focused, for instance, on the idea of mass alienation. So David Harvey talks about mass alienation, the rise of a precariat that's united in its feelings of anger, enemy, anxiety, and alienation. So that's Guy Standing. And the idea that there's a corrosion of character and a collapse of occupational identity. So Richard Sennett. So like the workers in Black Creek and the frontline service providers, these bird's eye view characterizations of grand narratives also capture uncertainty, insecurity, and contradictory dynamics of working class politics. Enemy, echoing Durkheim, alienation, referencing Marx, poverty and discontent seem to all stand on equal footing, and the relationship between these is hard to decipher. So whether I try to make sense of my research inductively or I turn to the literature to unpack what's happening, I'm left with a fairly unsatisfactory approach to what we see as unsettled working class politics. So in this presentation, I'll talk about how I've tried to make some sense of what we see as contradictory narratives or narratives that are in tension in the landscape of worker politics that are emerging in this one particular place, Black Creek. So before I do so, I just want to provide some conceptual reference points for the analysis. And the first one has to do with the relationship between these changing structures and the narratives that workers and frontline workers provide. So I start from the premise that changes in regulations and institutional arrangements, so changes in the way work is organized, require an accompanying shift in the normative understanding of work by employers, workers, and their families, and the communities in which they live. So economic transformations of regulations, institutional organizations, are in part a negotiation or require a negotiation about the meaning of the everyday activities that constitute the sphere of work. So in this paper, I want to get at how individuals in a priority neighborhood are habituated through daily activities to precarity. The second concept I bring to the analysis is the idea of unfree labor. And I think in general we understand what that means, but I think it's worthwhile to consider its contemporary manifestation in Canada. So in general, unfree labor refers to work that people do where they're employed in the context in which there's a threat of destitution, detention, violence, lawful compulsion, or extreme hardship to themselves or their families as part of the underlying contractual obligation. All right? The clearest example of unfree labor in Canada today are all of the temporary migrant worker programs, right? Where an employee is tied to their employer by a visa, cannot circulate in the labor market, and is compelled to provide labor whenever the need arises or risk being fired or deported. But there's also important forms of labor that blur the boundary between free and unfree labor. Judy Fudge has talked about these, Guy Standing has talked about these, and so we can think obviously of the temporary employment agency or retail service work in the case of people who have a SIN 9, so a precarious legal status and therefore deportable, as being in this fuzzy territory between free and unfree labor. So part of what I'm interested in is looking at how that boundary between these two spheres gets eroded in these daily activities that is the working life of people in Black Creek. This other concept that I bring to this, which comes out of another kind of way of thinking about work, which is the organizations literature, is Vicky Smith's notion of employability practices, right? So Smith defines employability practices as a mixed bag of employment-related activities and strategies that may operate within or outside of formal job structures and that are socially constructed as a stepping stone for improving the odds of actually finding a job where you get paid. Right? It's not even certain that you'll find that job, but it's a sense that I have to do a bunch of things to maybe improve my chances of getting a job. And so the kinds of employability practices we can think about are identity management or reputation work, right? Short-term training, professional development, networking, accepting unpaid work, accepting marginal paid positions, for instance, internships, in the hopes that you will get to know the boss, you will network, you will improve your CV. All right, so all of this unpaid stuff. So now I want to present you with some of the research data to look at the dynamics of unfree labor and unpaid work, and some of the ways in which Black Creek residents are habituated to the precarity of unfree labor and unpaid work through their daily lives. Okay? So the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of moving away from thinking about understanding precarity through the employment relationship, right? So wage work, free labor, to thinking about the economic landscape and the trajectories of economic activity that human beings actually undertake. So in order to make sense of worker narratives, or to define how workers are habituated to precarity, we need to think of working lives in terms of economic activity very broadly defined. So starting from the research in Black Creek, what we see is that each of the 90 workers we interviewed had a very complicated, multi-directional trajectory of economic activity. Everyone had signed up and taken jobs through temp agencies, so fuzzy line between free and unfree labor. They had on-call casual contracts. Some of them also engaged in income-earning activities in the informal and shadow economy. All respondents had undertaken a common set of unpaid employment-related activities that were always readily available and promoted in their neighborhood. They were constantly enrolling in short-term workshops, resume clinics, certificates for food handling, child safety, etc. They practiced their interview skills, they volunteered at the agencies where they received services, and attended research seminars, sometimes focus groups paid through honoraria by people like me. In other words, the working life of the precariously employed research participants extended well beyond anything that we might remotely understand as an employment relationship. We can locate these different activities in distinct types of contractual relationships and normative frameworks. So what we see is that workers experience a landscape of economic activities where sometimes they were employed under conditions of free labor, and other times, more often than not, through temp agencies and other arrangements, they were employed in conditions that approached unfree labor. They also moved between paid and unpaid work. And so there was this common sense understanding that undertaking unpaid work would eventually lead to securing paid work, or that at the very least, that those who tried, or those who didn't try, had not achieved paid work because they simply hadn't tried hard enough. So if we want to understand these kind of unsettled narratives and interpretations of a working life, how workers make meaningful sense of their working lives, we need to recognize and track workers' movements as they move through these different arenas of free and unfree labor, paid and unpaid work. If we attend to the patchwork quality of work trajectories, we're better positioned to analytically unpack how this unsettled and contradictory narratives are produced through people's daily lives. So the other thing I want to talk about is the role of service providers in habituating people to precarity, which connects a little bit to the question I asked of the previous panel. So in the interviews with service providers, we asked people, and we conducted 3 focus groups, 2 with frontline and 1 with management staff. Everyone worked in agencies in Black Creek. Because this is designated a priority neighborhood, they received a lot of funding in the period just before we had done the interviews. This is a big population of service providers and of agencies. So in the interviews, we asked participants to identify programs and services that they thought were working and those that were not working for Black Creek residents. When we look at which program service providers consider to be working or not, and the reasons that they identify for why they work, we capture another dimension of the economic landscape of Black Creek. Their discussions help us further unpack how Black Creek workers are habituated to precarity and the sources of sometimes counter-narratives to this process of being habituated to unfree and unpaid labor. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on one fairly heated debate that happened in one focus group around the question of volunteer work. Okay? So this is the discussion that ensued. So one person started out, and it was interesting because this guy was a caseworker for OW. Volunteerism, it's a big issue in my personal opinion. It's like an industry by itself. It's cheap and free labor, because why can somebody be employed or taken in as a volunteer and not taken in as a paid worker? So the response from someone else is, I would like to speak on behalf of volunteerism. Some agencies do not have a large budget. So he's referring to the community agencies. So they need volunteers to come and assist because they do not have the money to pay employees. What the person coming in can get in exchange, question mark, they get experience in the environments. They get familiar with what it's like to go to an office every day, what it's like to run a photocopier or answer phones. Okay, so after I think volunteering also, so this is another person. Also, I think volunteering has to come with some acknowledgement. So here the emphasis is on acknowledging, not paying. People need to make ends meet and they need to survive. And you know, this idea of volunteering really did sort of emerge from a white upper middle class idea. I have a lot of free time, I'll volunteer, I'll sell cookies on behalf of the parent council. It's that sort of ideology. But if I have 2-3 kids at home and I'm living in TCHC and I'm depending on assistance, for me to come in and volunteer my time 10 hours a week, I think agencies have a responsibility to acknowledge the time that our volunteers are giving us with their knowledge and their skills by doing our best to see if we can, pay some sort of honorarium or, some sort of acknowledgement in the form of money, not just a certificate, because a certificate isn't going to pay the bills. So there's a lot going on there. Acknowledging as opposed to work, and honoraria as opposed to a wage. So this is somebody else, and this is the last person speaking. Volunteerism is one of the strategies that work, because like most of the places where you go and they ask you to, do you have Canadian working experience? And most of the immigrants, they don't know how to gain Canadian working experience. So if you volunteer your time, it's a strategy that will work for you because you're gaining an experience. Also, you're gaining references. Because in case you go, they ask you, do you have any work references? If you never volunteer your time, you will never get proper references. So the discussion spans from a critique and a rejection of volunteering, approval that it helps underfunded agencies, the idea that people get skills for doing low-end work, so essentially getting prepped to do temp work, as far as I can read that quote, and a push to acknowledge in some way the labor of the volunteer, but in a very fuzzy, it is not clear. So if we think of this quadrant of unfree and free labor, paid and unpaid work, when the critique emerges of acknowledging, it is not a call to have people do unfree paid labor. It's all over the map, all right? So, conclusions. I've covered quite a bit of ground and raised some questions, probably didn't answer. I am working this out, and I really do appreciate that I'm getting a chance to present it to you. I'd like to offer some summary of what I think are the takeaway messages of the question that I started with, which was really why worker narratives are unsettled, and related to this, how and to what degree are working class communities habituated to precarity. So I started talking about contradictory and unsettled kinds of interpretations of work that are expressed by workers and residents of Black Creek, and I connected this to a broader discussion about the hard-to-read nature of working class politics globally. I emphasize the importance of making sense of politics through the lens of everyday negotiations about the meaning of work, because it's in those everyday negotiations that we legitimize and normalize a transformation that is occurring at the structural and at the organizational level, right? It doesn't work unless you consent, right? The research in Black Creek reveals two trends. The first highlights the importance of thinking about the employment beyond the employment relationship to the landscape of economic activities that inform workers' understandings of their lives as workers. So in Black Creek, we see workers moving between paid and unpaid work, free and unfree labor. They're moving through arenas in which control is exercised in very different ways. The realm of wage work under conditions of freedom or unfreedom emphasize control through coercion. The realm of unpaid work is really about control through disciplinary mechanisms and largely through self-regulation, managing yourself as being job ready. And I think part of the confusion in this unsettled landscape has to do with kind of thinking about the mechanisms of control that are actually exercised in those different quadrants. I'm a sociologist, so I'm obsessed with the 2x2 table, so I talk in terms of quadrants. So people are moving around the quadrants, but they are experiencing very different versions of control. So if workers are talking in contradictory ways about work, it's in large part because of the boundary crossing trajectories that they experience on an ongoing basis. So People are, for the entire duration of their working lives, moving from free to unfree to paid to unpaid labor. And that constant moving around as a kind of central feature of your working life completely unsettles the readings that we have from a Fordist framework of worker politics. The second trend in the data reveals how a community can be habituated to unpaid work and unfree labor through the programs delivered by community agencies and by the program workers' interpretations of what people have to do to get work. So I think it speaks a little bit to the question of people, whether they agree with the services they're delivering or not, are habituating themselves and the people with whom they work to unpaid work as a necessity of being considered job ready and deserving of a wage work. So we see in this case that the discussion about volunteer work is fraught with disappointment, with resignation on the part of the frontline workers. It suggests that agency workers sometimes habituate workers to unpaid work, but other times, quietly, and this is I think where we need to kind of start pulling it out and coming up with an alternative framework for thinking about the sector, we do see threads of critique, whether it be in the form of resignation or a full-on rejection of their role in habituating their community members to precarity. Thank you.
Hi everybody, and let me start by thanking Carlo and Steve for inviting me to be part of today's event. I've learned a lot, and I hope you will learn something from my presentation as well. What I'm going to talk about today are two different approaches to renewal in Toronto's high-rise suburbs, and these are approaches that directly reflect the theme of today's event. So the first that I'll talk about illustrates the impacts of suburbanizing austerity. And my example will be a municipal program in Toronto called Tower Renewal. The second approach illustrates alternatives to the austerity agenda, and my example is an activist community group in Etobicoke called W6CAT. Let me just say this talk is based on research that I undertook as a co-investigator in the Global Suburbanism's Major Collaborative Research Initiative, which is housed in the City Institute at York, and it's headed by Roger Kyle, Professor of Environmental Studies here. I'm going to very briefly state my theoretical framework before I get into talking about these two examples. And my theoretical approach has two key components: neoliberal governance and the in-between city. So my approach to governance questions is guided in part by the work of Theodore and Peck, who tell us to challenge an understanding of neoliberalism as authorless, omnipresent, and monolithic. Instead, they argue we should always see it as a constructed project, and we should attempt to denaturalize neoliberal urbanism as a policy paradigm by exploring its origins, its evolution, and its variegated form. In a similar vein, Patrick Le Gallet and Olivier Boras advise us to look very closely within a general terrain of neoliberalizing urban governance at just what is governed and just who is governed. So they ask, what part, sector, group of the city is really governed, what is weakly governed, what is left out, what is escaping government. And then finally from David Harvey, I take an understanding of neoliberalism as a hegemonic mode of discourse that has pervasive effects on ways of thought to the point where it has become incorporated into the common sense way many of us interpret, live in, and understand the world. And indeed, we can see that neoliberalism has successfully constructed a new notion of common sense with austerity at its core. So the second component of my theoretical frame is conceptualizing high-rise suburbs as in-between city, and this draws on the work of German urbanist Tom Sieverts. So if you were to read 1960s planning policy as I had done, you would see that Toronto's high-rise suburbs are the result of policies from that era that encouraged the development of more urban suburbs than those that had been built in the 1940s and 50s. And specifically, municipal planners called for a substantial number of dwelling units to be built in high-rise buildings. The result in Toronto is this remarkable landscape of what is now referred to as the inner or older suburbs, with high-rise rental apartment buildings lining arterial roads and sometimes grouped into clusters of tall buildings. So I conceptualize this type of landscape as an in-between city. It's a landscape with some elements of typical North American suburbia: wide roads, parking lots, shopping centers, bungalows, but it also has some elements of what we think more typically represent a central city: tall buildings, high-rise apartment buildings, and concentrations of public housing. In Toronto, between about 1950 and 1980, more than 1,100 high-rise rental buildings were built across the city, many of them in what are now called the inner suburbs. And in total, they comprise about 1/3 of all dwelling units in the city, and they're home to about 1/5 of the city's total population. And 85% of the towers are privately owned, and 15% are in the nonprofit sector. While the suburban rental towers were initially conceived of as settings for new and desirable kind of everyday life, they are generally no longer seen in that light, but rather as physically worn out and socially stressed. Several recent reports, notably the United Way's Vertical Poverty, have documented the deteriorating conditions of the buildings and the increasing racialization and impoverishment of their residents. Suburban tower neighborhoods are widely perceived today to be a problem in need of a solution. So these two theoretical components combine to guide my research as a consideration of how to live today with the legacies of a previous era's urbanism. So, in other words, how to govern the legacies of 1960s urban design, urban planning, and housing policies in the case of Toronto's high-rise suburbs in the context of present-day neoliberalism and its foundation on austerity as common sense. So, I will now present two approaches to that question and to the question of renewal in suburbs that are deemed to be in decline. And the first approach is the city's program called Tower Renewal. This program originates in a building science class that was taught at the Faculty of Architecture, University of Toronto in the year 2000. That class examined the case of Toronto's post-war concrete apartment towers and determined that while they have a structural lifespan of 300 to 400 years, the concrete in them, every 50 years they will require a complete retrofit of all other aspects of the building: exterior cladding, windows, roofs, elevators, mechanical systems, kitchens, and bathrooms will all need replacement. Many of those buildings are now at the stage of needing the first of those total retrofits. So that's what the class studied. One of the students in that class developed those ideas in his master's thesis in architecture. Those ideas were picked up by a local architectural firm that hired him upon graduation, and then championed by the mayor at the time, David Miller. And in 2008, the city established a tower renewal office with a handful of staff reporting to the city manager. The initial goal of this municipal program was to create supply-side conditions that would entice building owners to rehabilitate their properties. It was argued that building retrofits would reduce energy consumption, they would improve the quality of life for tenants, and they would enhance the exchange value of the buildings that these owners had in their portfolio. Subsequently, the goals of the program have expanded to think beyond the scale of individual buildings to consider tower neighborhood revitalization that would include improved social and community services. The fundamental tool that the program hoped to initiate was for the city to establish a financial institution that would make low-interest loans to tower owners in order to let them make improvements to their buildings. The city would use its good credit rating to borrow large amounts of capital at very favorable rates. And then they would make loans with that money to the building owners. In cases of non-repayment of those loans, the city would use its taxing powers to add the outstanding balance to the property tax bill. But setting up this institution, this financial institution, requires provincial approval, which is not being forthcoming to date. So we're now 8 years into the tower renewal program, so I think we can ask reasonably, to what extent has it been a success, to what extent has it been a failure? In terms of material improvements to everyday life for suburban tower residents, it has had extremely limited success. The funding that the program has managed to cobble together to date has been minimal, whereas what is actually needed if the goal is to address the entire rental housing stock in the towers that were built in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, which is more than 300,000 apartments, is roughly $7.5 billion. What is distinctive about tower renewal, I believe, as an approach to suburban renewal, is that it weaves a progressive strand through what is otherwise a clearly neoliberal project. It seeks to improve the material well-being of hundreds of thousands of ordinary people. It acknowledges the importance of retaining the suburban towers as an important stock of relatively affordable housing. But at the same time, it indirectly contributes to the overall shrinking of ambition around affordable housing and around the capacity of the state to act directly on the crisis of housing affordability. Instead of creating new nonprofit units, the focus is on rehabilitating existing affordable stock, most of which is privately owned and all of which will be at risk of higher rents post-renewal. Retention of existing rental housing becomes the de facto affordable housing policy of the city, while creating new nonprofit housing quietly disappears from the policy agenda. Okay, approach number 2, the story of W6 Cat, or my subtitle is The Power of Saying No. W6 Cat stands for the Ward 6 Community Action Team, and this group was established to represent the interests of low to moderate income tenants living in rental housing on Lakeshore Boulevard in Mimico, a district in South Etobicoke. In 2006, the local city councilor had prompted city planning staff to embark on a planning exercise called Vision 2020, a revitalization action plan for Mimico. So the area we're looking at is this. So Vision 2020 was premised on the idea of renewal through private sector redevelopment. The Mimico lakefront, in the eyes of the councilor, was a neighborhood in decline that could be revitalized through what was presented as the natural and inevitable process of hyper-intensification in the form of new high-rise, high-density condominium development. Tenants in the 1950s and 60s era buildings that currently line the lakefront feared that they would be uprooted and forced out of the community. So W6CAT formed in response, whoops, I'm getting ahead of myself, formed in response to this, which was one of the visions that came out of this visioning exercises. So they were one of several community-based groups that countered this view of renewal. What was distinctive about W6CAT was its focus on promoting tenants' rights and protecting the rights of current tenants in the 1950s and 60s buildings and their right to remain in Mimico. There were two key figures in W6CAT. One was the health promotion program coordinator from the local community health center who saw housing as crucial to public health. And the other was the president of a local nonprofit housing cooperative who was committed to the principle of housing as a right. I came into contact with W6CAT through my involvement in the Global Suburbanism's research project, and I saw an opportunity for active research in which I thought, contribute something to the group's project. When W6CAT members expressed frustration at the limited public consultation the city was prepared to undertake as part of its planning work in Mimico, I suggested they undertake their own parallel planning exercise and call it a people's plan for Mimico, and that would at least force the city planners to acknowledge their presence. So one amazing event they organized was an all-day or a half-day people's visioning exercise that drew somewhere like 50, 60, 70 people to the local library, where they spent a Saturday afternoon talking about their neighborhood and its future. And it really was kind of a remarkable event with 5-year-olds, 8-year-olds. I gave a talk called What is Good Planning? And for me, that was one of the most challenging talks I've ever had to prepare, knowing that the audience would include 5-year-olds and 80-year-olds and a huge range of people. So in effect, what W6CAT did was attempt to shape, this is jumping ahead, there it is, I'm jumping ahead. W6CAT did was attempt to shape a counter-hegemonic discourse around planning and neighborhood renewal. Their goal was to challenge the fundamental assumptions underlying the Mimico 2020 process. The equation of community renewal with market-led property intensification, the limitation of affordable housing policy to retention of existing rental stock, the unspoken assumption that neighborhood gentrification is a positive outcome, and the superficiality of most public planning consultation exercises. Eventually, Toronto City Council approved the Mimico by the Lake secondary plan. A secondary plan is a neighborhood scale official plan, and the secondary plan clearly bears the imprint of citizen activism, in that the councillor and all of the major property owners in Mimico are extremely unhappy with it and with the restrictions that it imposes on any new developments. So in conclusion, I think Tower Renewal and W6CAT represent two very different approaches to renewal in an age of austerity. Tower Renewal is an example of what I label progressive neoliberalism, a fundamentally neoliberal project that includes a thread of progressivism that serves to mask its true character. In contrast, W6CAT is a counter-hegemonic attempt to unseat the new common sense. And I present it as a success story, but caution that its success may not be widely reproducible. And I think their success, their particular success, is linked to the combination of a number of factors. Those two amazing leaders, Sandra and Brenda, who really set up the organization and gave it its energy, a long history of community activism in that particular neighborhood, widespread, organic, long-term knowledge of the district and planning reports and various policies stretching back decades, and the fact that Mimico was a separate municipality within Metro Toronto until 1967, which I think fostered a very strong sense of community identity and culture. Nevertheless, it does suggest, I want to believe, badly, at least the potential power of saying no to austerity. And thank you.